What remained was the record of the incident, documented in unit diaries, mentioned in memoirs, occasionally surfacing in the oral histories of soldiers who were there. It is not a famous episode. It does not appear in most biographies of Patton, at least not at any length. But it tells you something that the famous episodes do not always manage to convey, that even at the very end, when the outcome was certain and the fighting was nearly over, the question of what soldiers owed each other, in honor, in recognition, in the basic dignity of earned respect, remained worth fighting about. Return, then, to that April morning in 1945. The war is nearly over. The prisoners are being processed. The paperwork is accumulating in the way that paperwork always does at the end of things. And on the chests of several German officers, men who have surrendered, men who have calculated the odds and decided that this particular fiction might be worth trying, are medals that do not belong to them. Silver stars, bronze stars, small pieces of metal that represent, in the formal language of military honor, the specific judgment of a nation that a specific person, in a specific moment of danger, did something worthy of recognition. Patton sees them, goes quiet, then is not quiet at all. He removes the medals. He orders the officers charged. He returns the decorations to the process that will, eventually, attempt to return them to the people or families to whom they actually belong. It is a small act in the context of a war that killed 60 million people. It is not comparable to the liberation of the concentration camps, which Patton's forces also accomplished and which affected him visibly and permanently. It is not comparable to the great strategic decisions that shaped the course of the campaign. It is, in the long arithmetic of the Second World War, a footnote. But it is a footnote about something that matters: the insistence that honor is not transferable, that a medal is not merely a piece of metal, but a record, that the record belongs to the person who made it, and that no amount of defeat, desperation, or calculation changes that. Patton understood this in his bones, whatever else he failed to understand. The German officers who wore those medals understood it too on some level, understood it well enough to think the fiction was worth attempting. They were wrong about that. On that particular morning, in that particular command, the man in charge was not interested in fiction. He was interested in getting the medals back to the people who had earned them. And, in his way, that is exactly what he did. In several accounts, Patton personally removed the decorations from the German officers' uniforms himself. In one version of the story, disputed, but repeated in enough memoirs to suggest at least a kernel of truth, he flung one of the medals at a German officer's feet, with a remark to the effect that the man had not earned it and would not be permitted to pretend that he had. What is not disputed is what happened next. The medals were collected, catalogued, and turned over to American military authorities for eventual return to the families or units of the soldiers they had originally honored. The German officers responsible were formally charged, and Patton made it a standing order within his command. Any German found in possession of American military decorations would face immediate investigation, with the medals treated as stolen property, which, in every meaningful sense, they were. To compare this episode to the broader treatment of looted property in the final weeks of the European War is to realize how unusual Patton's response actually was. By the spring of 1945, the Allied advance was sweeping through territory that contained some of the greatest concentrations of looted art, gold, and cultural property in human history. The Nazis had spent 12 years systematically stripping occupied Europe of everything valuable, from the contents of Jewish homes to the altarpieces of Polish churches to the gold reserves of a dozen nations. American soldiers encountered this looting on an industrial scale. The famous Merkers salt mine, discovered by Patton's own Third Army in early April 1945, contained the bulk of the Reichsbank's gold reserves, hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks in currency, and thousands of pieces of art looted from across Europe. Patton arranged for Eisenhower himself to visit the mine. The scale of what they found was staggering. Against this backdrop of systematic, state-sponsored theft, the matter of a few American medals on German uniforms might seem relatively minor. What made it important to Patton, and what makes it worth examining now, was precisely the personal dimension of it. The looted art was a crime against history and culture. The stolen medals were a crime against individual soldiers, against the specific men and women who had stood under fire and been judged worthy of recognition by their country. That particularity mattered to Patton in a way that abstractions never quite did. Other American commanders in the same period tended to treat captured German officers with a degree of professional courtesy, the code of mutual regard between military men that had survived, somewhat battered, even the ideological brutality of this particular war. Patton's insistence that the medals be returned and the responsible officers charged represented a sharper position, that there were limits to that courtesy, and that wearing a dead man's honours had crossed them. German officers in American captivity in 1945 were generally treated according to the Geneva Convention, housed, fed, and protected from violence. The treatment was far better than that received by American prisoners in German hands, a comparison that was not lost on the soldiers administering the camps. But Patton's order added a specific condition. The theft of American military decorations would be treated as a serious military offense, not a cultural curiosity or a minor violation to be processed and forgotten. The lasting significance of this episode is perhaps easier to assess now than it was in April 1945. At the time, it was one incident among thousands in the chaotic final weeks of a 6-year war. Patton himself would be dead by December of that year, killed in a road accident near Mannheim that robbed history of whatever he might have done in peacetime. Though given his personality and politics, one suspects peacetime would not have been entirely peaceful. But the episode illuminates something about the psychology of defeat and the strange calculations made by men who knew they had lost but had not yet fully accepted what losing meant. The German officers who wore American medals were not, in most cases, men who had collaborated with the Allies or earned those decorations in any legitimate sense. They were men trying to construct a fiction, a narrative that might, in the chaos of mass surrender, be mistaken for something more advantageous than what it actually was. Patton's refusal to permit that fiction was consistent with the broader Allied position in those final weeks. Unlike many commanders who were prepared to accept face-saving measures from surrendering German officers, allowing them to retain ceremonial swords, addressing them by rank, treating the whole business as a conventional military capitulation, Patton tended to view the German military establishment with a cold, clear eye. He knew what they had done. He had seen enough of it. The idea that a Wehrmacht officer might walk into American captivity decorated with the honors of the men his army had tried to kill struck him as not merely offensive, but fundamentally dishonest. And dishonesty, in Patton's moral universe, was close to the worst thing a soldier could be. The medals themselves, those that could be identified and traced, were eventually returned through military bureaucratic channels. The process was slow and imperfect, as such processes always are. Some were reunited with families, others entered military museum collections. A few inevitably were lost again in the subsequent decades of paperwork and institutional reorganization that followed the war. It is the 14th of April, 1945. The war in Europe has perhaps 3 weeks left to breathe. American armored columns are slicing through a Germany that can no longer quite believe it is losing, and General George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army, military showman, self-declared reincarnation of ancient warriors, is moving fast through the crumbling heart of the Reich. On this particular morning, Patton's staff officers are processing a large group of captured German soldiers near the Czechoslovakian border. It is routine work by now. The war has become, for many American soldiers, a kind of grim administration, processing prisoners, cataloguing surrenders, tabulating the wreckage of a broken nation. But then, one of Patton's aides notices something that makes him look twice, and then a third time. On the chests of several German officers, men who have just surrendered to the United States Army, are decorations, medals. And not German medals, American ones, silver stars, bronze stars. In at least one account, a Distinguished Service Cross, decorations that had been earned in blood and misery by American soldiers fighting across North Africa, Sicily, and the long crawl up through Italy. Medals that honoured sacrifice and bravery, medals that belonged to men who, in some cases, were still fighting, or were dead. How they came to be on the chests of German officers is a story that cuts to the heart of what this war had become by its final weeks, a story of looting, desecration, and the peculiar psychology of men who believed, even at the very end, that they might yet bargain their way out of what was coming. And what Patton did when he found out tells you everything you need to know about the man, and something uncomfortable about the chaos that consumed defeated Germany in those final days. To understand this moment, you need to understand what the final months of the Second World War looked like on the ground, not in the clean lines of history books, but in the grinding, chaotic reality of a continent coming apart at the seams. By early 1945, Germany's defeat was no longer a question of whether, but when. The Wehrmacht was retreating on every front. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east with a ferocity born of everything they had suffered since 1941. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine in March. The once mighty German war machine was running on conscripted boys and old men, on ersatz fuel and collapsing morale. But armies in retreat do not simply dissolve, they leave things behind. And in that leaving, in the abandoned barracks, the overrun supply depots, the hastily evacuated hospitals, a great deal of American property had fallen into German hands over the years of fighting. Consider the mathematics of it. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States Army suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties across multiple theaters of war. Every one of those casualties left behind equipment, weapons, clothing, personal effects, and decorations. American medals were awarded in the field, pinned to uniforms, carried in breast pockets. When a soldier was killed or captured, those medals did not always make it home. Some were recovered by graves registration units, others were collected by military historians. Many simply vanished into the wreckage of battle. German soldiers had been picking up American equipment since the landings in North Africa in November 1942. Some of it was practical. American boots were famously superior to German ones by the middle of the war. American rations, American cigarettes, American weapons when ammunition permitted. But decorations? Medals? There were several reasons a German officer might have an American medal in 1945, and not all of them were innocent. Some were trophies, pure and simple, the sort of dark souvenir that soldiers on every side collected. Some had been taken from American prisoners of war, which was a violation of the Geneva Convention, but far from the worst one committed in this conflict. And some, in those final desperate weeks, were being worn deliberately, with the calculated hope that, in the confusion of mass surrender, an American decoration on a German chest might be mistaken for evidence of good character or cooperation, or some prior friendly relationship with the Allied cause. It was this last possibility that most enraged Patton. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. There is much more history like this waiting for you on this channel. George Smith Patton Jr. was not a man who handled insults with equanimity. He was 60 years old in the spring of 1945, a career soldier who had fought in the First World War, competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Olympics, and spent the intervening decades developing both a mastery of armoured warfare and a personality that his superiors found simultaneously indispensable and exhausting. He slapped hospitalized soldiers he considered malingerers. He wore ivory-handled revolvers. He gave speeches that would make a merchant sailor blush and a historian reach for a notebook. He also had a reverence for military honor, for the decorations and traditions and codes of conduct that gave military life its meaning. That was, in its own way, completely sincere. Whatever his faults, and they were considerable and well documented, Patton believed in the dignity of the American soldier, with something approaching religious conviction. When he was informed that captured German officers had been found wearing American military decorations, his reaction was immediate, physical, and characteristic. Several accounts from staff officers present describe him as going very quiet, which, for Patton, was a more ominous sign than shouting. The shouting came shortly after. The German officers in question were brought before him. The precise words he used are variously reported. Patton was a man whose language did not always survive the transition to official record, but the substance of what followed is consistent across multiple accounts. He demanded to know where the medals had come from. He demanded they be returned. And he made it unambiguously clear that wearing the decorations of another nation's military, particularly decorations earned by men who had died in combat, was not a matter he was prepared to treat as a minor irregularity.